c'est le seul qui reste au bout de nos jours. Les vœux que l'on fait, les fleurs que l'on sème, chacun les récolte en soi-même. Au beau jardin du temps qui court, gens du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour. Gens du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour. Le temps de s'aimer, le jour de le dire, font comme la neige aux doigts du printemps. Fait-on de nos joies, fait-on de nos rires, ces yeux où nos regards se mirent. C'est demain que j'avais 20 ans. Gens du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour. Gens du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour. Le ruisseau des jours aujourd'hui s'arrête et forme un étang où chacun peut voir comme en un miroir l'amour qu'il reflète pour ces cœurs à qui je souhaite le temps de vivre nos espoirs. Gens du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour. Gens du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour. Gens du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour. Gens du pays, c'est votre tour de vous laisser parler d'amour.
Hey everybody, it's Aunt Bibi. Salut tout le monde, ici la tante bébé. Today is Sunday, June 24th, and happy Quebec National Holiday. Bonne fête nationale. Bonne Saint-Jean-Baptiste. Today is also St. John the Baptist Day. So that was the unofficial national anthem of Quebec. And in Quebec, they consider themselves one of the founding nations of Canada. So they're sort of they consider themselves semi-autonomous. I would say it's a token form of autonomy that they have in Quebec. And that song was composed in the 1970s by one of Quebec's finest songwriters, Gilles Vigneault. And that was him singing his own song, his own composition. And so St. John the Baptist Day, that became the national holiday, June 24th. It's a holiday in France. And I've been in France when they've celebrated it. And it's just it's a party day. So people dress up in costumes, and it's when the summer days are very long, and they just have a great time late into the evening. And they do the same thing in Quebec. It's a big party time, and it's a big celebration. And it's sort of when they sort of assert their independence from the rest of Canada, show that they're, they got their own culture and so forth. So what I like about this song is that it's a national anthem, but there is no mention of patriotism, nationalism, war, militarism, none of that. It's a song about love, about memories of love. And in fact, the word love, either as a verb or a noun, occurs in that song 10 times. So it's also, that song became so popular that they used that song to sing Happy Birthday. So instead of singing Bonne fête à toi, so forth, they sing a version of this song. So if people were to sing to me, they would sing Cher Barbara, c'est à ton tour de te laisser parler d'amour. Cher Barbara, c'est à ton tour de te laisser parler d'amour. So that's how they would sing Happy Birthday. That's a nice song. I like it. So I think every national anthem should be more like that song. And so the title is Jean Dupé means countryman, I would say. There's a very bad translation in below this YouTube video, but I will write my own lyrics in English because I used to be a translator and I never liked translations. If it sounds like a translation, it's no good. So I studied, I was in French immersion. I studied French in high school and college. And I also went to French immersion school in at l'UQAC, which is l'Université du Québec à Chicoutimi, the University of Quebec in Chicoutimi, and also in Quebec City at l'Université Laval, that's Laval University, the oldest university in Canada. So today I'm just giving a little, let's call it a Quebec Heritage Minute, shall we say. In Canada, people are familiar with on the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting, they would give these Canadian Heritage Minutes. So today I'm going to do a Quebec Heritage Minute, and this is for my Canadian content for my channel. Since I have dual citizenship and I'm American, but I live in Canada and have Canadian citizenship too. So Canadian content is a term they use in the broadcasting industry here. They have to broadcast so much Canadian content, and they abbreviate it, they call it CanCon. So today I want to talk about a very interesting time in Canadian history and Quebec history, and it is called the October Crisis. And what's interesting is that this happened when Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, was the Prime Minister of Canada. So Justin Trudeau is the current Prime Minister of Canada, and his father was Prime Minister at the time of this October Crisis. Now, this happened when Quebec separatism was at its peak. Quebec and Quebec, they don't call it separatism, they call it sovereigntism. So I remember my family went to the Expo 67 in Montreal. That was the World's Fair in Montreal in 1967. And I remember being there, and suddenly there were cannons or something being shot off, and there were flags little flags flying through the air. They were shooting out. They were French flags, and that's because the president of France at the time, Charles de Gaulle, was visiting Quebec, and he must have come to the grounds of the Montreal Expo 67. So I remember that very well. And then I learned later what happened when he visited. He was traveling around Quebec, and he would visit a town, and he would say something. He would always say, "Vive Chicoutimi, vive Jonquière," or whatever town he was in. He would say, "Long live Chicoutimi, long live Jonquière," whatever. And then he finally arrived in, I don't remember if he ended up in Quebec City or in Montreal. I'm not sure. I can't remember now. And he just got so worked up. He finally said, "Vive le Québec libre. Long live free Quebec." And that really shocked people when he said that, because they were very sensitive. The Quebec officials were very sensitive to the separatist movement at the time. So that's a very key phrase, and no one forgets. Vive le Québec libre. And so that was in 67. So in 1970, well, in the 60s and early 70s, they were having a lot of problems with terrorism. And there was one group in particular called the Quebec Liberation Front, and they were carrying out bombings of mailboxes and different facilities. And let's see, I think there was even a picture of a mailbox here. Oh, yeah. So they were bombing mailboxes because the mailboxes had this royal coat of arms of Canada. Yeah, there it is. That's the royal coat of arms in Canada. And the Quebec Liberation Front, they were fighting Anglo-Saxon imperialism. So Quebec was conquered in the 18th century by the British, and so it was no longer New France. It became British territory and eventually became Canada. Or, yeah, it actually was Canada. The Quebecers called it Canada. They considered themselves real Canadians because it used to be the old timers in Quebec that would say if you couldn't speak French, they would say if someone couldn't speak French, oh, il est pas canadien, canadien. That's how they would say Canadian. That's sort of a dialect. So here's a postal box they had. It was spray painted, so it's got FLQ. That's the Quebec Liberation Front. That's the French abbreviation. Oui, yes. So they were carrying out bombings and the FLQ, and they called themselves, they were called the Felkiste because it was sort of, they would take FLQ. So when you say FLQ in French, it'd be FLQ. So they would add ist, so a Felkiste, a member of the FLQ. So they were bombing different places in Quebec to fight Anglo-Saxon imperialism. They wanted an independent Quebec. It was a Marxist-Leninist group, and they wanted a worker society in Quebec because I remember in Quebec that traditionally all the businesses and all the bosses were either English Canadian, or American. So English was, in the workplace, I think they needed to make people speak English. So, excuse me, taking a drink of water. So that was kind of a sore point for a lot of Quebecers that all their bosses were Anglos. So that's what the FLQ was fighting. And so they were bombing. And then they started kidnapping. They started kidnapping foreign diplomats. So in October of 1970, they kidnapped a British diplomat in Montreal, James Cross, and held him. And then later, they kidnapped, on October 10th, and they kidnapped a Quebec provincial government minister, the Minister of Labor, Pierre Laporte. And so they held him, and eventually they strangled Pierre Laporte. And so, when the kidnappings happened, that's when the officials really took things seriously. So they brought out the army, and eventually, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he invoked something called the War Measures Act. Now, the War Measures Act was really designed for when there really was war in Canada. But he used it for internal security reasons. And the War Measures Act meant that they could arrest people and detain them indefinitely without habeas corpus. So they started rounding up people not only in Quebec, anybody even suspected of any kind of connection with any separatist group in Quebec was picked up. Anybody even, they were picking up anybody, and it was a very scary time, especially in Quebec, but they were picking up people all across the country. And this was a scary time, and there were demonstrations being held against this at universities in Canada. I think generally the public was in support of this because they were really scared about, I guess, insurrection in Quebec and Quebec separating or something serious happening. So, but it was a terrible time, and I think a lot of young people I think a lot of young people in Canada, they're not familiar with this story. They should be, because it was a very scary time. And so older people, and older people in Quebec especially, and so even though Pierre Trudeau is sort of a national icon, I've always considered him a fascist. And I remember when I was in Quebec, the older people, they didn't really think too much of Pierre Trudeau. And there was one, René Levesque, who was a sort of a leading separatist official in Quebec. He always referred to Pierre Trudeau by his English name, Elliott. And I think his mother was the Elliott. That's where that came from. So they didn't really consider Pierre Trudeau one of them. He was more of Anglo. So they called him Elliott instead of Trudeau. So very scary time. And what happened was, so Pierre Laporte, the Quebec government minister, died, and they eventually found the FLQ members who had kidnapped him. And but the British diplomat, he was they negotiated his release in exchange for what's interesting, they negotiated and let the kidnappers of James Cross go to Cuba. And Fidel Castro at the time agreed to take in these Marxist-Leninists who had participated in the uprising and kidnapping of James Cross. So that was a very interesting twist to the story. And so that's, it's a very interesting story. You can do your own research into the October Crisis, as it's known in Canada. And here's the Wikipedia page for the Quebec Liberation Front. So it's a very interesting group. And what I found interesting is that at the end of this, I thought this is interesting, that there's some story that this this was sort of a false flag operation, CIA false flag operation, and there have been so many. Now, Wikipedia, of course, debunks this story, but I find it interesting that this FLQ, this kidnapping, these kidnappings led to the War Measures Act being imposed and martial law. National martial law. So it's kind of interesting that there is this story about the whole thing being a CIA false flag, because then they were able to impose martial law, and that was maybe like a test of how far they could go. That's how I see it. So I also read that Pierre Trudeau reorganized the military. So the Canadian military was supposed to be to defend the country from external security threats, but Pierre Trudeau sort of reassigned their mission to protect the country from internal security threats instead. So that's interesting. So that's why I've always considered Pierre Trudeau a fascist, even though he's some kind of hero in Canada. I've never really thought much of him. And the same goes for his son. So I just expect the worst from Justin. So that's my take on things. So that is my little video for today. I just wanted to do a little special Quebec National Holiday video. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for your patience, and comment, thumbs up, thumbs down. Please share, and have a nice evening. Bye.